One of the things I learned over the past year is that there are some companies that just completely own me. One of them is Sega, another big one is Square Enix, and perhaps the kings of occupying my brain, they're Spike Chunsoft. They're best known as the developers behind Danganronpa, Zero Escape, and that game that you should buy with money. And they really went off in 2019 releasing all kinds of games, which I bought nearly all of. Look, I was weak. Anything Pink Girl here talked about, I was at least a little bit interested in. Obviously there were a lot of gems, stuff like Steins Gate Elite, Zonky Zero, and please play it. But there was another, a game that dropped last August and one that just seemed to pass everyone by. And that game is Crystar. What is Crystar? Well, how about we find out? First, let's take a look at our key players. We have Fu Ryu, who are a developer slash publisher who've worked on a couple other RPGs, and... wait, Higginbana was on 3DS? We have Gemdrops, who worked on some VR game, and... ooh, just a whole bunch of people actually. Oh hey, Naoki Isaya, I recognize that name. He worked on Canon. Wait, Canon's a key work. Aren't all those supposed to be really sad? So let's get right into the story. A girl named Rei Hatada and her younger sister Mirai are trapped in purgatory, having been brought there by a lingering spirit named Animesis. Though Rei is bestowed a blessing which grants her the power to fight back, she loses control and, in her rage, accidentally kills Mirai. She is then approached by Mephis and Felice, the managers of Purgatory, who offer her a deal. If Rei forges a contract with the demons, fights the monsters within Purgatory, and collects enough of an element known as Idia, they will bring Mirai back to life. However, her soul is slowly heading towards the bottom of Purgatory, where the cogs of renewal await, and where her soul will be turned anew. Thus begins Rei's journey through Purgatory, fighting through both monsters and her own tears, all in the name of saving her sister. Let's make this perfectly clear from the start. Crystar's story is pretty sad, and sometimes it lays into that fact very hard. The souls of Purgatory are those who've lived very tragic lives, be it those who've died of illness, people who just had plain bad luck, children whose lives were cut short, and even those who've taken their own lives. This makes Rei's journey through Purgatory a very taxing one for her. Through every chapter, she gets put through the ringer, always being pushed to her limits, and always taking on more burdens as she attempts to save Mirai. With all of that said though, the story isn't all doom and gloom. Helping Rei is a number of characters who help keep the story from being 300% sad. I really do like these characters, and the little banter that they share throughout the game serves as the light that shines through what is otherwise a very bleak story. Okay, saying it like that makes it sound like Crystar's story is bad, but that isn't the case at all. It's very somber, yes, but it's equally as engaging as it is sad. Despite the atmosphere and all the stuff that I mentioned before, the suffering in Crystar doesn't feel like it's overdone. All of the characters have goals that they can realistically achieve. Rei wants to save her sister, Kokoro wants revenge on Animesis, Sen wants to learn the truth behind the bus accident 1 year ago, and Nanana... okay, Nanana's just vibing, but I can respect that. Watching them push through the suffering that they have to endure gives the necessary hope that keeps you pushing forward as well. In that, Crystar succeeds where other works in a similar vein fail. Just look at all those dark magical girl shows that were trying to be Madoka without understanding what Madoka was. All of them are dark and filled with horrible things, yes, but there it all just feels like it's too much, to the point where the struggles and the suffering feel unrealistic. Crystar is a fantasy, obviously, but the overarching struggle is very real. The struggle to keep pushing through awful situations in hopes of eventually reaching happiness. That's what keeps you going, too. Despite constantly being met with horrible thing after horrible thing in the story, you keep pushing through because you know a happy ending is possible. You just need to keep going in order to reach it. I'll touch on the story a bit more later though, so for now let's shift gears a bit and actually talk about the game part of this video game. Crystar is split into multiple chapters, further divided by individual ordeals. Once in Purgatory, the game is an action RPG, with your standard light and heavy attacks, and a dash that can be used both for dodging and quickly moving. Your goal is to find the exit of each floor, while fighting any enemies that stand in your way. Okay, that isn't quite true, as the game only occasionally locks you in with the enemies, but while avoiding conflict saves time, and God knows Ray would love to not fight, that's ill-advised. For starts, fighting enemies is how you get experience, and this is pretty standard. You get enough experience, you level up, and while it does have changes to your stats and restores your health, the big draw are the skills that you get at certain levels. These can be equipped to any of the face buttons, and can be activated by pushing them while holding R1. Using these skills eats up your SP, which can be regained by using your normal attacks. Enemies also drop items and essence, which is this game's form of currency. These can be exchanged at the shop for a number of items. However, weapons and armor aren't among them. So how do you get those? Well, these are also obtained from enemies. Monsters with red halos over their heads are revenants, souls who maintain their memories and consciousness, and attack souls in pursuit of revival. These enemies are tougher, and by defeating them, you can take their soul fragments. Doing so fills you with all the emotions the revenant felt, which takes a toll on your heart and influences your stats. Because of this, you can only hold 10 at one time, though you have to be actively trying in order to reach that limit. Once you complete an ordeal, you can purify these torments by having a nice cry. Cheers, girl, I'll drink to that. And this turns them into equipable sentiments, taking the form of weapons, armor, and accessories. To make these even stronger, you can also fuse them. By having multiples of the same sentiment, and having enough thought fragments, you can combine them to further increase your stats, upwards to 4 times. To take it even further, some sentiments have modification slots. By pumping fragments into these, you can apply additional modifiers to the characters that have them equipped, usually in the form of stat boosts or resistances. Helping you in battle is your Guardian. Automatically, they'll jump in to counter when you take damage or block fatal attacks. On the bottom left of the screen is your tier gauge, which can be filled in 2 ways. The first is the traditional way, by attacking enemies. By maintaining a high combo, you can fill it even faster. The second is crying. By pressing L1 when the gauge is empty, your character will stop in place and cry, sacrificing SP in exchange for filling the gauge quickly. Once it's full, hitting L1 summons your Guardian for a limited time, greatly increasing your attack speed and your power. Hitting it once more allows you to use a finisher, burning up the rest of the tier gauge in exchange for one devastating attack. Just make sure you aim it right, because it isn't a screen nuke, and missing one of these is an awful feeling. The game also has multiple characters, which are unlocked as you advance through the story, and can be switched on the fly by pushing the D-pad. There is incentive to switching as well. As you take damage, a portion of your health bar will turn red, and by switching to another character, that red portion will heal naturally over time. In addition, the character that gets swapped in will receive a brief attack buff depending on how much damage the other took. Unfortunately, much like another game, the game doesn't really incentivize using all the characters. Granted, their individual strengths and weaknesses are very clearly defined, but some are just inherently better than others. Ray attacks decently fast, has good damage output, and her skills are both really good for damage dealing and crowd control. Kokoro is very clearly stronger than her, but in the same way, her lack of speed and combo potential is also abundantly clear. It's just not as good. Sen deals less damage per hit, but she more than makes up for that for her raw attack speed, and her skills, if you position her right, can pierce through enemies almost obnoxiously fast. And Nanana? Well, okay, you got me there. Her attacks consist entirely of ranged attacks, which would work better if the levels were designed with that in mind, and I guess her spells are good for crowd control, but she goes down like she's made of paper, and there's nothing she can really do that the others can't do better. Ultimately, throughout the game, I only really used Ray and Sen, and since you'll always have at least one of them in your party, that meant it was pretty smooth sailing throughout. The problems don't just stop at the character balance, though. Every ordeal plays out exactly the same, with nothing but the aesthetics setting them apart. Occasionally the game will limit what characters you can use, but these are the rare exception. A similar kind of sameness goes for the enemies too. They all have unique names and stories, sure, but functionally they're just palette swaps, behaving exactly the same as the ones that came before them. Some of these are also pretty annoying too. These plant things can easily blindside you, and they're often tucked away in the corners of rooms. These bombs can be tough to hit without getting hit yourself. These things can take a lot of punishment, and these guys can not only hit you from a distance, but they can also inflict status ailments. While running past all of them is an option, finding the right path through the dungeons can also be a hassle. You can see where the exit is on the minimap at all times, but rarely will the direct path actually lead you to it, meaning you have to run down all kinds of paths in hopes that it's actually progress. There are items and chests to find for sure, but even these are just the same items that you can get from beating enemies and the shop, so they're not really worth seeking out. And these ordeals aren't short either. If you have bad luck while navigating, these can easily take up to a half an hour, and again, every ordeal is exactly the same. The game is pretty easy too. Granted, it's not a cakewalk, you do have to be conscious about keeping your gear up to snuff, and there is a hard mode if you want that, but all it really serves to do is to give the enemies more health and have them hit harder. Playing on normal, I was able to cruise on by, even when being sloppy with my dodging, and that's because of how health items work. The base healing item, the bitter chocolate, heals 30% of your HP, and because that's a percentage, that means it scales up along with your max HP. And since the price always stays the same, which is to say, very cheap, it's never not useful to have the max 20 of them. Your HP getting low? Just down chocolate like it's going out of style and you'll be back up in no time. You can even set the items to be used automatically when necessary, further trivializing the matter of healing. There's also the matter of pacing. Crystar has 8 chapters. Kinda. This is kinda hard to talk about without spoilers, so I can't get too into it, but the game, despite being completely linear, has multiple endings. After achieving one, the game rolls back the clock, and you continue playing in order to get a new ending. Think of how the Nier games do it, or I guess in this particular case, Drakengard is a more apt comparison. The good news is the game dumps you off at Chapter 6, so you don't have to start an entire new playthrough from scratch just for a new ending. The bad news is, again, these chapters are exactly the same, and the aesthetics don't change the second time around either. There are new story elements and new bosses to keep things fresh, but the act of playing through these last few chapters multiple times can be pretty taxing. Hopping back to something positive, I adore the presentation of the game. Granted, some of the cutscene animation is a bit stiff, but the models are all really good, and these environments are gorgeous. Every chapter may function the same, but they are all visually distinct, all using a vibrant color palette that makes everything pop. I'm also in love with these character designs. Don't know what's up with Kokuro's tail, but everyone just looks extremely cool. The Day 1 version of the game even comes with an art booklet, and that's a super neat bonus, highlighting just how good this art really is. And these illustrations too. I actually recognize the artist for these, Hajime Ueda. He worked on the Fooly Cooly manga and did this rad end card for Madoka. These illustrations are fantastic, and the filter and brief animation makes these some of the most haunting moments of the entire game. The game's soundtrack is also great too. It's really hard to put into words, but every track has this unique feel to it, which only further enhances the game's tone. Even the most intense battle tracks still convey the idea that Purgatory is a dismal place to be, and the only track that I would outright call comforting also happens to be the only track that exclusively plays in the real world, and that's a really cool touch. I'd love to play some samples, but I feel like Sakuzo would assassinate me if I tried, so you're just gonna have to listen to them yourself. The voice acting is also really solid too. The game obviously has a Japanese track, but I want to give shoutouts to the English cast because they did a fantastic job as well. Brianna Knickerbocker did a phenomenal job as Rei, and right from the very beginning, you can feel how much emotion is put into the role, and it helps carry all the impactful moments of the story. I also gotta bring mention to Cassandra Lee Morris and Jackie Lastra as Memphis and Felice respectively, who serve as excellent contrasts to one another, and... Wait, hang on, what did I just say? Cassandra Lee Morris. Cassandra Lee Morris. And there's talks about contracts too. Cassandra Lee Morris. Hey, wait a minute. Sadly, Crystar doesn't really offer much in terms of extras. There's no New Game Plus, which is unfortunate, and though there are a number of optional ordeals, these are just more of the same missions as the main game, just one-floor dungeons that are mainly there for you to grind torments. It's really unfortunate too, since there are some late game ones that have additional dialogue and boss fights, but there's only a small handful of them. There's also the Memoirs of the Dead, which functions as a bestiary of sorts. All the enemies and bosses are recorded here, alongside snippets of when they were alive, which are unlocked by collecting their torments. It's nice for world building and adds to the overall somber feel of the game, but getting all these requires grinding, and a lot of it, so that's really only worth pursuing if you're going for the platinum. So once again, it seems I'm in the precarious situation of listing a lot of complaints about an all-in-all average action RPG, and having to justify why I'm gonna recommend it anyways. Because, spoiler alert, I highly recommend playing Crystar at least once. Part of it is a familiar feeling. I've alluded to it throughout, but I'm quite a big fan of Madoka Magica, and I'm also a big fan of Nier and Drakengard, and hey, turns out Crystar takes inspiration from that. I get Madoka from the story and the themes, and I get Drakengard and Nier from the somber tone, some key story beats, and the fact that those are also kind of a struggle to play through. Much like all those, Crystar managed to get some very genuine reactions from me, as people who follow my Twitter can attest to, and I always value when a piece of media can get a rise out of me. Multiple times throughout, I had to take 5 after some particularly strong story beats. I remember one late game point that had me up from my seat and actually pacing around, and not everything I watch or play can do that. If I only loved Crystar for the story though, then it just as easily could have been an anime or a manga or something. But I don't think I would have enjoyed it as much as I did if it were one of those mediums, and I say that because what really ties everything together, for me, is how the story ties into the gameplay. I mentioned earlier the idea of an overarching struggle. That's a big theme that I get from the story, but I feel like it's conveyed through playing as well. Crystar is a struggle to play at times. It can be daunting facing down these same chapters over and over again. It feels like it takes a long time to get to a new story beat, and when you finally do get there, you're met with another event that causes things to get worse. Yet despite that, you keep going because you know at the end of it all, things will eventually work out. It's one thing to simply show characters struggling, but it's another thing entirely to directly convey that in gameplay, and that's a sort of one-of-a-kind experience that you can only get from a video game. Through taking the journey through Purgatory alongside these characters, and undertaking a lesser but equally as noticeable struggle, the theme that I mentioned earlier becomes clear. Despite our struggles, or indeed because we struggle, we're able to overcome our hardships and become stronger, and eventually reach the happiness that we deserve.
You must give meaning to your tears through your will. You must give meaning to the sadness and pain you endure, because it'll be unrequited, because it is unfair. Most importantly, use your tears to smile. I'm sure your future will be wonderful. So, give meaning to the tears.
Or maybe I just overanalyzed it, and I'm doing a bunch of mental gymnastics to justify my jank taste in video games. Who can really say? But what I can say is that Crystar is unique. It's pretty, it's flawed, and it's almost overwhelmingly miserable. But it does everything in a way that, at the end of the day, leaves me very fond of it, and it's an experience that's unforgettable. So, yeah, I recommend Crystar. For $60? No. But luckily, Swag Chunsoft puts their stuff on sale pretty frequently, so it's not too uncommon to see Crystar go on sale for around $30. That's what I paid for it, and yeah, I'd say it's a good price for it. So, congratulations, Furyu. You've left me emotionally scorned and very interested in your company. So here's hoping we get to see another game in a similar vein sometime soon, because I would be all for that. But until then, that's the end of me pouring my heart out over this niche game. So until next time, see ya. And you can pet the dog. Hell yeah.